15-minute or less lecture series, Anatomy and Physiology, Chapter 17, Urinary System. The urinary system consists of the two kidneys that are connected by the two ureters to the one urinary bladder, and urine leaves via the one urethra. The functions of the urinary system overall include maintaining normal concentrations of electrolytes and water in blood, helping to control red blood cell production as well as blood pressure, and the storage and elimination of metabolic wastes in the form of urine. The kidneys are reddish-brown, bean-like organs that are surrounded by a tough fibrous capsule. And it turns out the right kidney is a little lower than the left kidney because of the liver. The kidneys are considered retroperitoneal. They are not surrounded by the peritoneum. Instead, they are attached directly to the posterior wall of the abdomen by connective tissue and adipose tissue. The kidneys have a depression that leads to many structures going in and out of the kidney. This depression then opens up into what's called the renal sinus. So the hilum is the opening that allows the passageway for blood vessels, nerves, etc. And the sinus is where you see some of the important structures of the kidneys. Within the sinus, you have the minor calyxes, these special tube-like structures that then fuse to form major calyxes, which then fuse to form the renal pelvis, which then, as it leads out of the kidney, becomes the ureter. These structures carry urine, so the minor calyxes carry urine to the major calyxes, which carry to the renal pelvis, and then out the ureter down to urinary bladder. The kidneys have two distinct areas, darker areas and lighter areas. The darker areas are called the renal medulla, so each one of these areas is a part of the renal medulla. One of these areas by itself is called a renal pyramid, so all of the renal pyramids together make up the renal medulla. And the renal pyramids fit into the papillae of the minor calyxes. The lighter colored tissue is the renal cortex, found primarily on the outer side, superficial layers of the kidney. However, there are parts of it that go in between the pyramids, and those are called the renal columns. The kidneys' functions include regulating volume, composition, and pH of body fluids, especially blood. Also helps to regulate blood pressure and volume by secreting the hormone renin. The kidneys help to remove metabolic wastes from the blood, especially the compound urea. And it helps to control the rate of red blood cell formation by secreting the hormone erythropoietin. And finally, the kidneys also can release the active form of vitamin D, which then goes to the small intestine to increase calcium absorption. Blood flow obviously is important for the kidneys. So blood arrives via the renal arteries, then split into the segmental arteries, which become the interlobar arteries between the pyramids, and then the arcuate arteries on top of the pyramids, and then finally the cortical radiate arteries radiating into the cortex. Veins have similar names. You have the cortical radiate veins, and then carry blood to the cortical, to the arcuate veins, and then the interlobar veins, and finally out the renal vein. On the microscopic level, we see that the cortical radiate arteries eventually branch into tiny afferent arterioles. These arterioles carry blood to a capillary bed called the glomerulus. There are millions of glomeruli found in the millions of nephrons. The glomerulus, again, is a capillary bed, and then as blood flows out of it, it goes into the efferent arterioles, which then will eventually go into the cortical radiate veins. So here we have a capillary bed with arterioles on both sides of it, which is very, very rare. It's only in the kidneys that you see this. All right, so again, here is the nephron in yellow, and we see here the cortical radiate artery branching up to the efferent arterioles, which go into the glomerulus, which is inside the nephron, and then out the efferent arteriole. These may then go into what are called the peritubular capillaries, so that we have two capillary beds connected by an arteriole, and then it'll become a venule and out the cortical radiate veins. So the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. It's in both the cortex and the medulla. The nephron has what is called the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. The corpuscle is the filtering part. Fluids leave the bloodstream and enter the glomerular capsule, and then that filtrate is what's going to be modified and eventually become urine. So the renal tubules are then a series of tubes that will then return fluids and compounds to the bloodstream or pull them out to finalize what the urine is and the overall composition of the blood. The renal tubule includes the proximal convoluted tubules that come directly after the renal corpuscle, the nephron loop with a descending and ascending limb, and the distal convoluted tubule, just far away from the glomerular capsule, and then that'll connect to the collecting duct. So the distal convoluted tubule connects to the collecting duct. The collecting duct is collecting urine from thousands of nephrons, and technically it is not part of the nephron itself. When fluid enters the collecting duct, it is now officially urine, which then gets emptied into the minor calyx. So blood is in the glomerulus, that capillary bed. Out of it comes filtrate into the glomerular capsule, which then goes through the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule, and when what's remaining enters the collecting duct, it is now urine, and then it travels out the minor calyx to the major calyx to the renal pelvis, to the ureter, to urinary bladder, to the urethra, and out of our body. So here's a view of the nephron stretched out. Here's the glomerular capsule, the glomerulus in it, proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, and the capillaries that are running next to the nephron loop are intertwined with this structure. We find near the glomerular capsule is a structure called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. This helps to control the secretion of the hormone renin and also the blood pressure in the glomerulus. Turns out the glomerulus is at very high blood pressure for capillary beds, and so it needs to be controlled very carefully. The juxtaglomerular apparatus consists of part of the ascending limb of the nephron loop as well as the afferent arteriole. There are cells, the macula densa cells of the ascending limb of the nephron loop and the juxtaglomerular cells in the afferent arteriole that help to control the flow of blood into the glomerulus. So it can cause the afferent arteriole to constrict to reduce blood flow or to dilate to increase blood flow. If it restricts and reduces blood flow, pressure goes down. If it dilates and allows more blood to enter, then pressure goes up. Okay, urine formation is done in three processes. There's glomerular filtration, which occurs in the glomerular capsule. This is the fluid leaves the glomerulus, leaves the bloodstream, and produces a huge amount of fluid. Then in the renal tubules, we have tubular reabsorption. Fluid, water, as well as electrolytes, maybe nutrients, get returned to the bloodstream. So that's tubular reabsorption back to the bloodstream. And then finally, near the end of the renal tubules, you have tubular secretion, where some substances go from the bloodstream back into the nephron, and this is to help fine-tune the composition of the blood. So glomerular filtration in the glomerular capsule. It turns out the glomerulus, the capillaries, blood capillaries, are actually have lots of fenestration, so they allow additional fluid and materials to leave. And then there are the cells called podocytes that wrap around the capillaries, and they help to restrict the size of things that can leave. This way, proteins should not leave the bloodstream, but water, small nutrients, wastes, and electrolytes will be able to leave. Glomerular filtration occurs because, as I mentioned already, the glomerulus, that capillary bed, is under high hydrostatic pressure, high pressure for capillaries, and that means that the fluid is always leaving these capillaries. There's no net return of fluid to these capillaries. So a lot of fluid is leaving, and none of it is returning to these capillaries. Filtration rate depends on the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, the plasma osmotic pressure, and the capsular hydrostatic pressure. So plasmic osmotic pressure and capsular hydrostatic pressure, we're trying to send things back into the blood capillaries. However, the blood pressure, the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, is so high that it will overwhelm this. So there's a net movement of fluids out of the blood capillaries all the time in the glomerulus. To help control this pressure so that the glomerulus doesn't become damaged is the afferent arteriole. It can constrict, which will decrease the glomerular hydrostatic pressure because less blood is now entering. And then we also can have the efferent arterioles constrict. This would reduce the amount of blood flow out of the glomerulus, which would then increase the overall blood pressure. Glomerular filtration is like 180 liters 24 hours. This is a huge amount. If there was no reabsorption, then we would have to urinate 100 times more often than we do. That would suck. Luckily, we don't have to do that. There's also the renin-angiotensin system. These are hormones that end up being secreted. So when the juxtaglomerular cells will secrete renin if they detect that the overall blood pressure is dropped, so that there'll be less filtrate produced because we want to keep the overall body's blood pressure up, that it receives some sort of signal from the brain, or if the macula densa cells detect that the urine is extremely diluted, that there's very few electrolytes in it. So if these things happen, then renin will be secreted. It'll then cause a series of reactions that will finally lead to angiotensin II hormone being released, and this is a vasoconstrictor, which will cause the efferent arteriole to constrict. This will then act as a bottleneck, causing blood to spend more time in the glomerulus, increasing the pressure in the glomerulus, allowing more fluids to leave and compensating for the low blood pressure that apparently is occurring in the body. All right. It will also cause the secretion of aldosterone. Aldosterone stimulates the reabsorption, the saving of sodium and water, so that our urine is more concentrated. Sodium will leave the bloodstream, enter the renal tubules, into the bloodstream, and where sodium goes, water follows. So water will also leave and go into the bloodstream, and then this will help to try to conserve fluids to keep the blood pressure up. So the way it works, angiotensin always in the blood. The kidneys releases renin, which then turns angiotensin into angiotensin 1, which then signals the release of angiotensin 2, which causes the vasoconstriction, the production of aldosterone and ADH, which will then lead to more concentrated urine and an attempt to conserve fluids. And then also thirst. And thirst will cause us to drink water, which will then increase the overall blood volume, which would increase blood pressure. Glomerular filtration can also be affected by atrial natriuretic peptide. This is a hormone produced by the heart when blood volume is high, and meaning blood pressure is high. When this hormone is released by the heart, it will stimulate more dilute urine being produced. So sodium will be excreted, will be returned to the renal tubules from the bloodstream, and where sodium goes, water follows, and this will cause an overall drop in blood pressure and blood volume. Tubular reabsorption normally occurs primarily in the proximal convoluted tubule. Most of the fluid will be returned to the bloodstream, as well as any nutrients and some of the electrolytes. We'll then get continued activity in the nephron loop. So sodium ions get reabsorbed by active transport. Where sodium ions go, water will follow, as well as negatively charged ions like chloride ions. So these all return to the bloodstream. Tubular secretion is materials from the bloodstream get returned to the renal tubules. For instance, hydrogen ions to raise the pH of the blood, and potassium ions can be returned to the renal tubule to be secreted out. Here, as you can see, urine's composition is very different from what's found in blood or glomerular filtrate. Aldosterone stimulates the distal convoluted tubules to reabsorb sodium ions and secrete sodium ions. This leads to more concentrated urine, conserving water and sodium. Antidiuretic hormone also leads to more concentrated urine, trying to reabsorb and conserve water. And atrial natriuretic peptide leads to the release of water into our urine, to have more dilute urine, to lower blood pressure and blood volume. Urine composition should ideally be a light color and mostly water with some uric acid and some trace electrolytes and amino acids. Other things, nutrients, proteins, etc., should not be found in urine. Disorders of the kidney include renal failure. If this is chronic, then someone may have to go on dialysis to get their blood cleansed regularly. And ideally, they'll eventually get a kidney transplant to get their own renewed functions in their body. Urine elimination, collecting duct to minor calyxes to ureter, urinary bladder, urethra. The ureters are muscular tubes that carry urine by peristaltic waves to the urinary bladder. Urinary bladder is a muscular organ with muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue in its walls. It has this trigon structure composed of the openings to the ureters and the opening to the urethra. And it will constrict micturition reflex to send urine out of the urinary bladder into the urethra by causing the detrusor muscles, the muscles in the walls of the urinary bladder, to constrict and out the internal urethral sphincter. Then we can try to control it with the external urethral sphincter, but eventually we will lose that battle. When urine is eliminated, it'll go through the urethra and out the external urethral orifice. There are glands that keep mucus in the urethra, so it's nice and low friction. Urine elimination, it turns out females, their urethra is somewhat smaller, only 4 centimeters long. Males, their urethra is much longer at 22 centimeters long. This is because it has to go through the prostate gland and the penis. Hope that was helpful.